Once more, welcome back to the third video in this week one session on the three contexts that are helping us to read and to hear, perhaps in new ways or for the first time, the gospel that we call Matthew's gospel. Now we want to look at contemporary context. If we've talked about the world in the text, that's literary context, and we've talked about the world behind the text, that's historical context. Now we want to take a look at the world in front of the text. That's the world of the reader, the world of the audience. And one of the things, as soon as I say that you will recognize is that we have multiple, numerous, lots of generations of contemporary contexts. So the very first people who read Matthew's gospel were a contemporary setting. But now, almost 2,000 years later, you and I, reading Matthew's gospel in the Central Valley of California in late 2017, are a very different contemporary context. We too are sitting in front of the text. And this third lens of interpretation, or this third context that we're looking at, is asking questions like, what are the experiences, the assumptions, the values, the presuppositions that people bring to the hearing of a biblical text? So, for example, the vision of technology and mobility in the first century was very different than our experience of technology and mobility. In fact, our experience of technology in 2017 is not only very different than it would have been for people in 1917, 100 years ago, but what about 1997, 20 years ago? It's amazing to think how differently we experience our world, and all of that, the way in which our world is always changing, the way in which culture is moving forward and social values are changing and evolving, that has an impact or an effect on how we hear an ancient text like Matthew's gospel. So we have to take into account, how would Matthew's first audience have heard what he said about the person of Jesus and the things that he did? And then we also have to ask that question about ourselves. Let me give you one quick example. When we talk about people who get sick, whether it's ourselves or people that we love, I think you can probably all identify with me in thinking that our general expectation is that people who get sick get well again. That's just an expectation we have. We've got, medicine. We've got now with the internet, self-help, MD websites. We can go to a clinic. We can go to an emergency. But however we access help for a medical condition, we almost always expect to recover. We expect to get well. That simply was not true in the ancient world, right? So if we read accounts in biblical texts of healing or of someone recovering and getting well, it's hard for us to appreciate the surprise or the shock that people would have felt that someone who'd gotten sick would recover and get well. That's a good example, just one small example, of how different the world in front of the text is from the first century to our time now in the 21st century. So knowing our own setting helps us to apply what we've learned once we've studied the literary context and the historical context of a biblical text. Then we begin to be able to ask questions. And in Fee and Stewart, in the text that you're reading alongside this class, they refer to this as hermeneutics. So if exegesis is drawing the meaning out of the text, then hermeneutics is taking that meaning and applying it to our own setting. Let's put this one other way. Exegesis asks the question, what does the text actually say? And hermeneutics asks the follow-up question, what does the text mean? And let me just give you a small caution here, all right? Most people, most Christians, well-meaning, read the Bible and only ever read the second question. They only ever pick up the Bible and say, what does this text mean for me today? It's a good question, but it's the second question. The first question we have to ask is, what does the text say in its own time? That's the first question. And only when we've determined that can we make some moves and some decisions about what that text might say to our own world and our own time. So, what are the factors in our world that influence how you hear and how you apply the way in which you encounter the person of Jesus in Matthew's gospel? Well, the answer to that question is actually the point of the signature assignment, the last major assignment that you will do in this class. And in order to do that signature assignment, and you can read the full description in the syllabus or on the Moodle site, but the goal of that assignment is for you to take a current issue, can be a church issue, can be something your family is facing, can be a larger social issue, and you can be as controversial as you want. One of the things I would encourage you to do is pick something that you're either really concerned about, worried about, confused about, or just have a great interest in and want to dive in further. And then try to take what we hear, what we read, what we experience in a text like Matthew's Gospel and apply that to the setting in which we live. So for this signature assignment, you're going to start with what the text says, and then you're eventually going to, using some secondary sources and some help from our library and various sources, you're going to ask, what does the text then mean? How could we apply that message in our own world today? I don't know if you've ever heard people run around and say something like, what would Jesus do? Whenever they're faced with either a question in their own family or a moral dilemma or something like that, they'll ask that question, what would Jesus do? And although it's not a bad exercise to imagine what would Jesus do, the reality is that Jesus was a first century Jewish carpenter who became a rabbi. His world and his experience was completely different, just at a human level, from most of the ways in which we experience life. Yes, sort of basic emotions, basic intellectual capacity, some of those, the way we experience relationships, Jesus has all of that in common with us. But the world that he engaged and encountered was very different. So we want to ask the question in this class, not what would Jesus do, but what does a Jesus-style response look like in my world? In other words, given what I learn about Jesus in Matthew's presentation of him, how might that shape my response to any number of political, social, moral, family issues that I face today? That's the goal of the signature assignment. And the hope is that we're taking the literary context, what the words mean, that we're taking into account the historical context, the world behind the text of Matthew's Gospel, and then we're also taking seriously our own context, our contemporary setting, and saying, so how does all of that come together and help me think about how to take Matthew's Gospel and allow a Jesus-style response to shape the way I engage my world. I hope this excites you. Don't hesitate ever to be in contact with me. Again, the secret word that I'm asking you to email me just once after you've viewed these 3 videos is Pontius Pilate. That's Pontius Pilate. He's a figure in the New Testament, and if you want the spelling, you can look that up in a variety of places, among which John 18 and 19 is one place. But go ahead and email me that. I'll look forward to your responses and forums, and don't hesitate to send me any questions you have. Have fun.